Good evening, everybody, and welcome to UMR CONNECTS. My name is Samantha Reem, and I'm a third-year student here at UMR. Thank you for coming tonight as we finish up our February theme of the often forgotten, prisons, poverty, and homelessness. Just a reminder, and for those who don't know, UMR CONNECTS is at 7 p.m. every Tuesday night. It's free and open to the public. The theme for March will be the amazing human brain, and if you haven't already done so, please sign in to get your name into our door prize drawing. The information is only used to let you know of upcoming events, and the winner will receive a $20 gift card to the M-Gear store at the end of the night. I'd also like to remind everybody that on March 10th, we will be celebrating our 4th anniversary of UMR CONNECTS and our 200th event. And next week, Jen Baste and Joanne Marsland will present Your Changeable Brain here in 417. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Born in Chicago and raised in the Twin Cities, Sanni experienced homelessness during her teen years. After her father was deported, her mother struggled to manage her undiagnosed schizoaffective disorder. Sanni witnessed her mother transition from what she calls a go-getting wife and mother to a vacant shell. She says her mother's condition left her incapable of maintaining a stable home for her family, and as a result, it led to numerous evictions and stays in several shelters spanning across Illinois and Minnesota. Sanni feels that this happened because neither her mother nor extended family had access to appropriate resources that would help in effectively managing her mental health and wellness. Now a radio and TV personality, behavioral therapist, and speaker, Sanni seeks to enlighten minds and hearts about her experiences in the hopes that other families can avoid situations like her own. Please join me in welcoming Sanni.
Thank you. I noticed everybody's on this side. Are you guys cool with me right here? Okay. Thank you for having me here. I'm just going to jump right into it. When I was first asked to do this event, it was the end of last year, and I looked at the topic. I kept running it through my head and asking my question, the often forgotten homelessness, prisons, and poverty, and I kept asking myself, why do we forget? Why is it that we constantly forget about them? I'm sure everyone in here knows at least one person who's homeless, you know someone who's in prison, and you know someone who's in poverty. And if you don't know someone directly, you know someone that knows someone. So if we're so closely connected, how is it that we're forgetting them all the time? And so for a few months, I've been struggling trying to figure out how I was going to present my speech. And a couple of weeks ago, I know it was crunch time, so I started Googling things about homelessness and poverty and being humble and random acts of kindness, and I came across this quote by Mother Teresa. And there's actually two quotes. They're very similar. And the quote actually changed my mind about what I thought about poverty. Before I go into what her quote was, I want to explain my view on poverty and what it's been my whole life. My whole entire life, up until a few weeks ago when I found this quote, I believe that poverty simply meant that you were lacking something tangible, money, clothes, shelter, something that you could touch. You were lacking it. And the reason why I believe that was because of the things I've heard in news. If they were ever mentioning something about the poverty line or the economic line, they usually were referring it to someone lacking something tangible. I also felt that way because if I heard a politician as a young person saying they were going to eradicate poverty, it was usually by supplying something tangible. So for years, I believed that poverty meant that you were lacking something physical. That's until I read this quote a couple of weeks ago. Mother Teresa not only felt like poverty equated loneliness and feeling unwanted, she felt like that was the worst kind of poverty. And after I read that, it was really hard for me to wrap my mind around it, because not only have I had my preconceived notions about what poverty was, I also immediately thought of extreme poverty. And when I think of extreme poverty, I think of third world countries where kids don't have fresh water, and their houses are like made of the materials that are around them, and they're running around without shoes. Like, I'm thinking extreme poverty. And Mother Teresa believes that the worst kind of poverty is loneliness and feeling unwanted, and that's worse than extreme poverty. So it took me a few days to really wrap my head around it, and I really struggled with it. And I kept trying to see her perspective, and what actually helped me see her perspective was something my college professor told me when I first started college about 15 years ago. I'm a psych major, and so one of my first classes was Intro to Psychology. And there's two basic things that you learn in Intro to Psych. You learn about all the founding fathers and who started the field, and you also learn about human development from conception all the way up to death. And so we were in the infancy stage, and I don't know about anybody else, but when you're in class, at least when I was younger, my professor says a lot of stuff and I don't catch everything, but I caught this one thing. This grabbed my attention. She was talking about how she admired volunteers who go down to the infant center and they hug abandoned babies. And that caught my attention, and all my classmates were asking questions about why that was so admirable. And she said the reason why is because there's scientific evidence that proves if an infant goes 2 weeks without feeling human touch or a connection, it'll die. And so it took me to remember that to help me understand what Mother Teresa was talking about. Even as an infant, if we don't feel wanted or we feel lonely, the will to live ceases. And so for 15 years, I've heard plenty of mind-boggling things about psychology. I love human behavior. I'm also a mental health practitioner, so I've learned tons of things about how the brain works and human development, and I've heard a lot of mind-boggling things. But for some reason, that one thing has stuck with me for 15 years, and I never really understood why until a couple of weeks ago when I found that quote. I, too, have experienced intense feelings of loneliness and feeling unwanted, and that occurred in my teenage years. I single-handedly watched how immigration, mental illness, homelessness, and foster care shrunk a family of 5 down to a family of 1. And I was that family of 1, left with all of those feelings of feeling like I was unwanted and isolated and lonely. And the reason I felt like that was because of the things I heard adults say around me. Now, I don't want to victimize them, but the things that they were saying made me feel really lonely and like people didn't understand what I was going through. On several occasions, family members, community members, parents of my friends would say things like they didn't want me to be around their kids because they felt like my circumstance would rub off on them in some kind of way. And so, one, to hear someone negatively speak about your situation as if you're not there, that made me feel unwanted. And 2, to have adults, tell me that they don't really want me to be around because of my circumstance that was out of my control, that made me feel unwanted as well. And so over the years, I have definitely dealt with intense loneliness and feeling unwanted, but that's the bad part. The good part about it is that I developed a trait. And it's a trait that literally, if you see it in human beings, if you have lost all hope in humanity and you see this trait, it will instantly restore your faith in human beings. It's also a trait that I've seen in people who have helped me over the years and who have helped me get to where I'm at today. And it's also the same trait that you'll see in those volunteers who go down to hug on the babies, the abandoned babies. A lot of people call this trait humility. I call it humility ability. Because it's one thing to have humility, it's another thing to actually be able to use it. And so my story actually starts out when I was 8 years old. I lived with my father, who was born in Nigeria, and moved to this country at a young age, and he wanted to come here to get an education. But I lived with my father, I lived with my mother, I lived with my older brother, and my younger sister. So we were a family of 5. We weren't perfect. My mom and my dad argued, like typical married people do. And but we were happy for the most part. We were kind of quirky. I've heard people say that we reminded them of the Addams Family, so whatever happiness you can see in that image, we had that. But a lot of that came to a halt when my father got pulled over in a routine traffic stop. When they ran his name, a couple of red flags came up. I'm going to kind of shortcut you and tell you the 2 red flags that eventually came up with my father, because after the traffic stop and he went downtown and came back home, there were 2 things that came up on his name having to deal with immigration. One, when he first moved to this country, he took advantage of a scholarship that was only intended for American citizens. And obviously, once they found him, they wanted him to pay that back. The second thing that hit my father was his visa. The grounds for his visa allowed him to permanently live in the United States, and it allowed him to study in the United States. It did not allow him to work. But when my father was a college student, he met my mom. They fell in love. They had me. They got married. They had my sister, and my mom had a child from a previous relationship. So my father went from student from out of the country to a father of 5. And I think he did what any decent dad would do, is immediately got a job. And so those 2 red flags came up on my father. My mom tells me that she went to my aunt because we were planning to take this big family trip. And she told my aunt, I want to take this trip, but they want us to pay the money back on the scholarship. And my aunt was like, well, if he leaves, you're not going to be able to go on the family trip. So give him the money. So she gives him the money. He goes down to the government office. He pays for it. And as soon as he pays for it, they are about to walk out, and 2 authorities come and say, is your name Kayode Imasu? And he says, yes. And he says, there's a warrant out for your arrest. So then he's immediately arrested for that, and that's when all of the struggles of him dealing with his violation of his visa came into play. So he eventually got out. I'm not sure about all the details, but I remember him coming home with and staying with me and my family while he was dealing with this. But him and my mom got an immigration lawyer. And my mom says that after they paid the immigration lawyer the money, he ran off with the money. So my dad at this point is upset. I mean, this was kind of self-inflicted with him going against the violations, of his visa. But he was upset. And before I go any further, I have to say this. I'm not sure anyone knows about Africans, but they are a very prideful people. And I think it's important to communicate that my father is not just a dad who decided to up and leave. He did as much as he could, considering the circumstances. But my mom says that he tells me, I'm not going to pay one more red cent. I'm not going to pay another farthing. My father comes from a very rich family in Nigeria. And the most impressionable thing that my mom says that he told her was, I'm not afraid to go home. And I know in most cases when you hear about immigration stories, they're scared to go home because their living conditions are not as good as here in the United States. And my mom said that was one of the last things he said to her before he made the final decision to just willingly go back home. He did not want to continue to put us through the rigmarole of dealing with immigration. And so when I was 8 years old, I believe it was the summer of '92, I saw my father. We were in a white room, and there was a double pane glass between us. And that was the first time I'd ever saw my father in handcuffs. And it was also the second time I'd seen him cry. The first time I saw him cry was a few years back. He was fighting with his father. But that was the second time I saw my dad cry. So it's a little scarring to know the last time I saw my father as a provider, the last time I saw him, he was in handcuffs and crying. And I know today that he didn't want to leave, but I know that in his heart he didn't want to put my family through all of that. And so he willingly turned himself in, and he was deported in the summer of 1992. So fast forwarding a few years after that, my mom up and decides, we're living in Chicago at this point, my mom up and decides, we're going to move to Minnesota. Now, where I come from, and I don't know, I'm very well aware, we had the map in my classrooms from the beginning of school all the way up to 5th grade. We've had the map, but honest to God, I'd never heard of Minnesota until this time. And I'm thinking, why not California? Why not Texas? Why not? I'd never heard of Minnesota. My image of Minnesota was horses and Greenland, and like I come from a big city, so to hear Minnesota, I'm like, why does she want to move to Minnesota? I had no idea, and I thought maybe it was a fluke at the time, and I just noticed she was serious. She was really making changes and going to my school and telling them it's going to be my last year, and I kept hearing her talk about it on the phone, and it was an extremely traumatic time for me because first my father's leaving, and now we're moving to this unknown place that probably has horse and carriages for all I know. So as the time winds down to us moving to Minnesota, I noticed that my mom is kind of spiraling into this person who's very internal. My mom's a very go-getting, happy, giggly person before this, but I'm noticing that she's getting really serious. She doesn't laugh as much. And my first impression is, oh, she's just upset because Daddy's gone. So my mom's going back and forth to the Twin Cities, checking it out, telling us about the Mall of America, and there's a big roller coaster inside this mall, and, trying to play it up to us. And eventually we make the move. And my mom struggled when she got here. I remember when we first got here, we were in We were in several shelters. And again, at the time, I didn't know why, but as an adult, my mom says that she faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism, and a lot of things that hopefully we're not seeing as much today as we saw in the early 90s. And so, but eventually we got on our feet. I started school, and I started getting friends and getting used to the idea of dealing with a place that's colder than Chicago, not as windy, but colder than Chicago, and so much snow. Like I'm really getting used to these blizzards that we have, and so I'm still noticing that my mom is getting more mean and more impatient with us. She took a job where she worked overnight, and I just assumed that she was working different hours than she worked when we were in Chicago, and that's why she was angry. And I noticed she started reading the Bible, and I thought maybe this will help her get used to where we're living, but it didn't help. She continued to get more angry about things and just impatient with us and yelling at us more. And I am in junior high at this point. And so I'm noticing my mom is spiraling into this, but my social life in junior high is just escalating. So I'm really fitting in really good with the kids at school until my mom decides that it's time for us to move back to Chicago. But before that happens, I'm hanging out with my friends one afternoon, and I come home, and it's a little dark. It's spring, but it's a little dark. It's late at night, and I come home, and the music is blasting, and it's pitch black in my apartment. And I kind of walk past my mom. I don't say anything. I walk past her and go into the room. At this time, I'm living with my brother, my sister, my mom, and my aunt. My aunt moved in with us before we moved to Minnesota. My aunt has Down syndrome, and she was pregnant, so my mom reached out a hand to help her younger sister out. So I go into the room, and I ask my aunt, what's going on with Mama? She said, I don't know. She's been acting weird all day. So we go to bed, and we wake up the next day, and this happens 2 or 3 more times. And I come home on the third time this happened, and the music's blasting, and it's pitch black, and I'm in my aunt's room with my sister-in-law, kind of, trying to figure out what's wrong with my mom, and she yells and asks me to do something, but I couldn't hear. And I said, what did you say? And she comes back to the room with one of those bars from the closet as if she's going to hit me. And I jumped up and ran to make it look like I was doing something. So I knew something was up because my mom is not like that. My mom did not discipline me in that sense. My mom would yell at me or take away the TV or something like that, but never has she ever attacked me with one of the poles from the closet. So I knew something was wrong. So the next day, I go to my friend's house, and I stay there. I don't come home. And I spend the night all the way into the next afternoon. I don't go to school. And I call home because that's the first time I'd ever done something like that. And I call home, and my brother says, where are you? I said, I'm at my friend's house. He said, why did you run away? I said, something's wrong with Mommy. There's something up with Mommy. There's something going on. It's pitch black in the house. The music's blasting. There's something wrong with Mommy. He says, well, you need to come home because you didn't tell her that you were at your friend's house. They called the police and everything, and I get home, and the police officer's standing outside. It's dark. And my mom is, when I get to my apartment, my mom is finishing up a conversation with the police officer, and I talk to him, and he says, is everything okay? Are you in any danger? I said, no, but something's wrong with my mom. I don't know what's going on. There's something wrong with my mom, and I'm telling all these people that there's something wrong with my mom, but I don't know what it is, so it's hard to communicate. Something's going on. And he says, well, I mean, do you feel like you're going to be in any danger if you go back home? I said, no, but there's something wrong with my mom. I don't know how to explain it. And so he says, well, if you're not in any danger, just make sure that when you leave to go to your friend's house, you just make sure you let your mother know because there's a curfew for kids your age. And he went about his business. And so my mom stopped with the episodes of the pitch black and the loud radio. And a week later, that's when she decides we're going to move back to Chicago. So I'm ticked off at this time. I'm mad because first we're living in Chicago. You make us get up and move to Minnesota, and now we have to move back to Chicago, and I have no idea what's going on. I'm in 8th grade. I'm totally into myself and the cool stuff that's happening in school dance. I'm just ticked off because there's no consistency, and I'm really getting upset with my mom. And she's just cold. She's not giving me any eye contact. She's like, let's go, everybody, let's pack. And we just got up and we moved back to Chicago. So after we moved back, we move in with my aunt. And for my adult opinion, I don't know that my aunt was all that happy about us moving back in because she lived in an apartment and we were loud kids. We were loud and happy kids. Like I said, my mom's a very free and willing and open and patient mother, and we were still kind of like that, and I don't think that was too welcoming on my aunt's part. We were jeopardizing her living situation, so we stayed with her for a little while. And somewhere between the time that we stayed with her, my aunt was asking me questions, have you noticed something's wrong with Mommy? I said, yeah, I noticed something's wrong with her. I don't know what's going on, but something's wrong. There's a change in her. She doesn't say anything to me, and she's a social worker, so I just assumed that she would know automatically that something was, she could give me the details on what was wrong with my mom. And so we move out into this terrible apartment. It's horrible. I call it a shack. It was absolutely terrible, but I know my aunt was in a rush to move us out of her apartment because, it was jeopardizing her living situation. So this apartment had no heat. It had an infestation problem, something serious. When we first moved in there, the exterminator came out to bomb the building. I don't know if we have any big city people who know what that means. It's when they come out, they come out and they just shoot off all kinds of chemicals. That did nothing. The roaches still stayed around. We still had mice. Like, it did absolutely nothing. Like, that place needed to be demolished. But we had no heat. We had an infestation problem, serious. And on top of that, my mom is reduced to sitting in the living room in this wicker chair that we got from Pier 1. And she sits in the living room every day, all day. And she has a tic. And she does this all day. All day. And I never really talked to my mom because I didn't know if she was going to snap. The last incident that happened with the pole in the closet kind of scared me, so I didn't really talk to my mom for about a year. I didn't talk to her. I just did what I can with helping with bills and going grocery shopping. My idea at that time, I'm 14, of grocery shopping was going to KFC. That was my idea, and going and buying chips and juice and stuff like that. But I did what I can with the knowledge that I had. And so we stayed in this apartment for about a year before we got evicted. And in that time frame, my mom had a falling out with the landlord. The reason why was because not only did we not have any heat, and we had a roach and a mouse problem, we also had horrible plumbing. And when I say horrible, it's totally not what you think horrible. It's way worse. When we first moved in, we had a few flushing issues. The landlord comes out. He fixes the toilet. It's very temporary. And a few weeks later, after he fixed it, we would flush the toilet, and the toilet would start to overflow brown water. And then it started to overflow chunks. And it got so bad at one point that it flowed all the way to the bathroom door. And the floor was covered, like maybe about an inch up of sewage, of waste. It was coming out of the tub. It was coming out of the sink. And the plumbing that was over the shower caved in. So my mom, in her state, we haven't had her diagnosed or anything. My mom, still in a place of functionality, tells my landlord, you need to come back out and fix this. He says, yeah, as soon as you guys clean it up. So my mom's going back and forth with the landlord, like, no, we're not going to clean that up. That's something that you need to do. Like, we'll do what we can, but we're not going to clean that up. That's disgusting. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. So she begins to call the city and complain. This makes the landlord upset. And so my mom and the landlord are literally having this, I didn't see it, this unseen fight for a year. And it got to the point, and it's uncomfortable for me to say this, but I think it's imperative to keep this a part of the story because it's the truth. But it got to the point where we had to use a bucket for the bathroom. And I remember it was in this room that we never used, and my mom, still in her state of not being diagnosed with anything, would take the bucket and throw it out in the dumpster in the back. And other tenants obviously took notice of this, and they complained to the landlord as well as to the authorities. And the authorities came out and said, you can't do that. That's unstable. My mom says, well, I have no way of using the toilet. Now, again, I think people would question the logic of my mom, but she's in this state of not being diagnosed, and there's obviously something going on. So my mom continues to do that. Now, meanwhile, I have no idea what's going on with my mom. I'm dropping hints to different people that I want to move back to Minnesota. I don't want to be here. I want to move back to Minnesota and go back to where, our toilets were working. And so one thing leads to another. She's continually putting it in the dumpster, and then we get an eviction notice that we're getting evicted. But it's not for destruction of property or unsanitary care of the apartment. It's for not paying rent, which was not true because my mom had been paying rent for months. And to me, it just seemed so out of the blue that it was her not paying rent. If my mom wasn't paying rent, we would have gotten some type of notice or something. It was just for not paying rent. And so on eviction day, 2 police officers came out. One of them was really, really mean. He was rushing us and telling us to get our stuff. And there was another police officer that my sister and I still remember, and he was very gentle with us. And I remember he would look at our apartment and look at us and look at and he was going through the apartment and just looking. And I just remember his disposition was very gentle with us and very caring and patient with us, while the other guy he looked like he was on a roll of evictions or something. But so now at this point, we are homeless. And we are walking the streets of Chicago. It's spring, so it's still a little cold and wet and rainy. We're walking the streets of Chicago, and the first place we stop is my aunt's house. And I don't know the conversation. Me and my sister stayed outside. My aunt at this time had moved out with her daughter. My brother's not living with us. It's just me, my mom, and my sister. And the first place we stop is my aunt's house. And I'm not sure of the conversation, but we couldn't stay with her. I'm told now as an adult we had a bunch of cats, and she didn't. If we would let go of the cats, we could stay with her. But I'm told that my mom wouldn't let go of the cats. So, so then we went to several shelters, and I don't know why my mom. It was important that we were able to keep our cats. I remember we had to keep them outside, and it was in the cold and the rain, and we would sleep in the shelters and go back outside to the box and go check on the cats, and it was extremely traumatic for 2 young girls. So after going to several shelters, we finally stay at this one shelter, and my mom is staying up late one night. I'm up, and my sister's sleeping, and my mom's like, "Do you want to move back to Minnesota?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to move back to Minnesota. I'm sick of this." So within the week, my mom gets her check, and we get on the Greyhound, and we move back to Minnesota. Now, luckily for us at this time, my mom has 13 siblings. So luckily for us at this time, my other aunt who had been living down south moved up to Minnesota. And so we had a place to stay in Minnesota. And we stayed with my aunt for 3 months. It was the summer. It was the summer of '97. We stayed with her for 3 months. But my aunt's girlfriend at the time was upset that we were eating up all the food, and they didn't like the living situation. And my mom walked in on them having an argument several times. There was even one time where we woke up late and they were arguing. And my mom says, "You know what? I'm not going to impose on your living situation. We'll just go to a shelter." So now we are at another shelter in downtown St. Paul. And it was a 30-day shelter, very short-lived. I remember the woman who was working with my mom was kind of short, stern with my mom, which kind of upset me. And I would always try to whisper to the different adults, "There's something wrong with my mom. I think my mom has a mental illness. Is there anything that you can do?" And they would always tell me, "We'll do what we can." But nothing was ever done. So then we moved to another long-term shelter, and we stayed there for maybe a month. And my mom tells me that when she first got there, they had her take a drug test. And she told me that they did me wrong. And I said, "Well, what's wrong with taking a drug test? You know, you're homeless. They don't know what's going on with you. You know, they should have to have you take something like that." And she says it was not a legitimate drug test. It was in someone's office. It wasn't like in a lab. And so, and I didn't know this at the time. I had no idea this was going on. I was just happy that we were someplace stable. And so my mom says the drug test came back positive for her using crack. And so all of these people are meeting up with us. Just, it was different. The treatment that we were getting in this shelter was different than what I had seen at other shelters. And all of these different people working with my mom and talking really mean to her. And my thinking was, why is everyone being so mean to my mom when something's going on with her mind? And I think they just saw her as somebody who had a drug problem who needed to get clean. I'm not sure, but that's my observation of it. But my mom was being defiant in her own little way. And eventually I came home from my friend's house, and I was asking the front desk receptionist, "Where's my mom?" She says, "I don't know, but you guys are getting put out." I say, "Why, what's wrong?" And she says, "Your mom's not following the rules." And I said, "My mom has a mental illness. I'm not sure what it is, but there's clearly something wrong with my mom. Why can't anybody see that?" She says, "I don't know, but you guys have to leave." So I I call the worker who was working with my mom. I get a hold of her and say, please don't kick us out. Please don't kick us out. We have been homeless and living in these different shelters. I'm tired of it. Please, whatever you need my mom to do, I'll talk to her and I'll try to make her listen. Just please don't kick us out. And I think that bought us maybe 2 more weeks of time. But again, after those 2 weeks, I went to my friend's house and with my sister, and I came back, and I got back, and it was really, really late, and I was asking them. I said, I don't know where my mom is. Where's my mom? They said she's in detox. I said, what's detox? They say that's where you go when you've been drinking and you are misbehaving in the public. And so I said, when am I going to see my mom? They said, well, they released her at the beginning, because this was a Friday when this happened. They said, well, they're going to release her next Monday. And I said, okay. So in my mind, I'm thinking we're just going to stay in that shelter until my mom comes. But this is the point where foster care comes into play. And so my sister and I are sitting at the shelter downstairs, not knowing what the heck is going to happen. This has just been a snowball of crazy things that have been happening in my life. And the front desk receptionist says the sheriff's going to come pick you guys up. So the sheriff picks us up. We go to, I believe it was Gillette. In downtown St. Paul, and they had us do a checkup. You know, I guess they were checking us to see if we had any communicable diseases or whatever, and then they drove us to an emergency shelter. We stayed at that emergency shelter for maybe a month or 2. I was defiant. I was ticked off at this point. I was 15 years old, and I was just sick and tired of all this stuff happening to me, so I was terribly defiant at this point. I was not following directions and coming in late, and so my first social worker coming into this picture had this idea of me as being a bad kid. And the reason why I was so defiant, obviously, was because all this stuff had been happening. So I'm going into the system as this defiant child who doesn't want to listen. So she tells us the process of what's going on. Your mom was in detox. We're going to try to help your mom get better. And in the meantime, you guys are going to go stay at a foster home. So we looked around at different foster homes, and we find one that we like. At least it appears that we like it. And so my sister and I, we move in, and they're very strict. They're very, 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 very strict. I don't want to badmouth them because I think that's bad karma. But it was not a good fit for me. That foster home was created for younger kids, 5, 6, 7, and I was 15 with just an inherent attitude. So I just don't believe that was a good fit for me, and I struggled in that home for the 9 months that I was there. I was labeled defiant. I was called out of my name, disrespectful. They just put unreasonably strict rules on me that I don't think any healthy, normal teenager would be able to live under. The stress that they put me under, I don't think anybody would want that to happen to any kid, regardless of their situation. But eventually I remember they sent me to a psychologist because I was like this bad kid. So they sent me to this psychologist because I needed help. And I go see the psychologist, and I remember one of the first sessions I had, I was just sitting I was just tired. I was sitting in the office with my head down crying. My eyes were so worn out all the time from crying all the time. And the psychologist, was trying to break through and get to me and ask me questions. And she said, what's really wrong? Why are you sad? I said, I think I'm crazy. I think I'm crazy. I do. I really think I'm crazy. All this stuff is happening around me, and no one's saying anything. They're acting as if it's normal. Am I the one that's going crazy? And the psychologist tells me at the time, you're not crazy. You're just a young person trying to deal with everything that's going on. And that was my little bit of hope. And so I continued to see this psychologist, and I was getting a little bit of hope that I'm a normal kid, dealing with all this crazy stuff. And I would write things in my diary that were defiant against what my foster parents at the time were saying about me. And, I'd write, I'm happy that, I'm not crazy and I'm normal and I'm a human trying to deal with these situations, and I don't care what anybody says about me. And they broke into my diary and read it, and that made them upset. And so they stopped me from seeing that therapist, and they had me go to see another therapist. And so the next therapist was really cool. She was probably, that relationship was broken with my first therapist, so I was a little apprehensive with the second one because I'm like, I don't know what's going to, I was really apprehensive with the second one, but eventually I continued to see her even when I started college. And so I am now a junior in high school, and this is This is still my first year of being in this first foster home. Everything at school is going pretty cool. I'm captain of the cheerleading squad. My boyfriend's on the football team. Everything at school is doing pretty good. I got pretty good grades. At home I'm just not fitting in, but I'm still able to balance everything out. And so something comes to my administration's attention. When my mom was sick and we were in Chicago, I missed an entire year of school. And so that information was transferred to my high school here in St. Paul, and they told me because of that I didn't have the grade point average to be captain cheerleader. And so, but never fear, I still snuck and I was a captain cheerleader. I did. This is my first time learning about SPNN. SPNN would would record our games, and somebody would be like, "Sanni, there's a camera," and I'd literally be ducking like this. So I still cheered. I was defiant in that sense. I still cheered. I knew that I needed something to take my mind off of everything that was going on in my life, but they were very adamant, and I remember hiding my warm-up outfit and hiding my cheerleading outfit, and I'm saying this like it's okay to be defiant to your parents, but I still did cheerleading. But the fall of that year, I had fallen out with them. I snuck over to my boyfriend's house. I didn't go to work. I was working at McDonald's, and I didn't go to work. I said I was at work, but I was actually at my boyfriend's house. And they called work to see if I was there, and I wasn't. So I came home, and I remember knocking on the door, and they were like, "You can't come in. Where were you at? We called work. You weren't at work. You can't come in." So I ran back to my boyfriend's house. And I was really scared because I had no idea what was happening. And it was about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night by the time they would finally let me back in. Because I called on the phone. I said, "Are you going to let me come back home?" And they yelled at me about lying about where I was at. And when I got home, they let me come in the house. But then the foster mom at the time immediately sets up an emergency session with my new therapist. And we go in, and I hadn't even talked to her between the time that I got in trouble and the time that we met up with the therapist. And we're sitting down, and she's just going in on me. She's defiant, and she's this, that, and keep in mind, I'm an honor roll student at school. Like, none of this behavior is linking up. This stuff is only happening at home. And she's just going in on me and talking about how bad I was, and I was sick and tired of it. And for me, that was a turning point in my life. Like, I was tired of it. I was sick and tired of adults behaving like they had no idea what was going on with me and not taking into consideration what was happening in my life. And I told the therapist that, I said, "You're wrong. You left me out late last night. It's your responsibility to take care of me." And that was my first time standing up to somebody that was older than me. So I really felt confident, but it got me kicked out. So it totally got me kicked out. So I went to my friend's house afterward, and I'm telling her, I'm like, I stood up to her. I finally, after a year of hearing all these bad things about myself and never saying anything and never arguing back or anything, I finally stood up to her. And I spent the night at my friend's house, and then I found out through my social worker or somebody that they were going to have me go now to an emergency shelter. And they were going to separate me from my sister and I. So at this point, I am by myself. I lost my dad, I lost my mom, my brother's not living with me, and now I've been separated from my sister. And I moved around to different teen shelters in St. Paul. I was at Booth Brown House. You'd be surprised how many home shelters there are for teens in St. Paul. But there was a lot of different places that I was placed at before I found my next foster home, which was like the savior foster home for me. It was a home that was actually created for teens. And I remember when my social worker said, "We're going to go visit this new lady," and I sat down and I talked to her, and she was telling me what she expects of me, and she expects me to be a part of the family, and which was odd to me because I've never heard that from the last home. Like, I was like, "You want me to be like," she was like, we go on trips, we go to Canada, and I expect you to be a part of the family," and that kind of threw me off. And I remember they asked me, "Is there anything you want?" And I said, "I have one condition. You have to let me see my boyfriend." And I remember at the time they looked at each other and just laughed at each other. And considering what I had been through, that was my one condition, was to see my boyfriend. It seems so trivial, but I was a teenager, so I move in, and things really started to turn around. My grades stayed consistent. I was still a captain of the cheerleading squad. I got into choir, and she would that was the first home I'd ever went tubing. That was the first time I understood why people really like Minnesota. We went tubing, and she let me take my boyfriend with, so she was a winner. She was a keeper. I wanted to stay there with her. And so, and they would have like big family barbecues and get-togethers at her house, and holidays. And I remember she got mad at me because when I was at the first foster home, I was in cheerleading and doing all this stuff to stay away from home. And so by the time I got to this home, I'm doing all this stuff, and she's like, when are you going to spend time with us? What's going on? So we struggled with that for the first couple of months, and I kind of tipped my way into it, because I didn't believe that somebody that I wasn't related to could be family. And so all the way up into my senior year, she tells me, you're going to be a debutante. I'm like, what's a debutante? She's like, oh, it's this big party, and it's a coming out party for teenagers. And I didn't care. I was captain of the cheerleading squad. So as as time is going on, I'm getting to connect with these other teenage girls around the Twin Cities, and I was very standoffish at the time, just because it seemed like everybody I got close to, they were ripped away from me. So I didn't enjoy being a debutante as much as I would have liked to, but it was still a really awesome experience, and I know that I owe a lot to my second foster home. I call her Granny. I still call her Granny, and she still calls me and yells at me to this day. Literally to this, you have mail over here. She still calls and yells at me to this day. So I have a very tight relationship with her. And me and Granny had our falling out like typical teenagers and parents do, but that's still my Granny. I know that without her, she helped me get into college. Concordia University, literally. I was like being lazy that year. I was actually depressed after graduating from high school. I was depressed that my mom wasn't around, my dad wasn't around, and everybody's having these open houses and these senior trips and all this typical Western culture type of celebrations that 18-year-olds have, their coming out parties, and I didn't have that. And I was really, 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 really depressed starting college. And so I remember it was like 3 weeks before school started. She said, come with me. And we go over to Concordia University, and she gets me enrolled like this. Like, she has that kind of power. And I promise if you say her name, people know who she is. Her name's Margaret Coleman. Just whisper that. She got me on good footing, and I was able to move out and get my own place. And I left the foster care system on a good note because of her. So to wrap up that story, I literally dealt with immigration, mental illness, homelessness, and foster care consecutively, straight through in my teenage years. And as I said in the beginning, there were a lot of bad things that people did to me that I've seen and witnessed along the way, but there were a lot of good things that I saw in the meantime. One was the police officer when we were getting evicted. I have no idea why, but his gentleness and his kindness, I remember specifically. The other guy was just so callous and just, let's go, we got to get up, we got to go. And I know when police officers come into a situation, they have to use an assertive voice. But the other guy, he was just so caring and patient and very gentle with us. And I remember that. I remember that. And because I saw that, I'm able to exemplify that to somebody else. The fact that my mom, even with her situation with my father, she extended her hand to help my aunt who had Down syndrome and who was pregnant. I didn't know at the time that all my other aunts had turned their back on her. And so even with my mom dealing with what she was dealing with immigration and having to deal with all the financial responsibilities coming to her, she also invites her aunt in. I was able to see that. I was also able to see the one emergency shelter that I stayed in before I moved to my second foster home. The woman was really, really, really sweet and gentle with me. I'll tell you this story. I was coming home from a game. I was cheering, and it was dark, and I didn't want to walk home by myself as a young teenager. I didn't want to walk home by myself, and a lot of the teenage boys at that time were smoking marijuana, and the only ride that I had was this car full of teenagers who were smoking marijuana, and I'm sitting in the middle as they're smoking around me. I'm in the back sitting in the middle, and I come out, and they drop me off, and I go into her house, and she's looking at me like, I know you were doing something. I know it. And she was like, where were you? I said, I was at the game. And she says, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah, I just came from the game. I told you I was cheerleading. She was, why do you smell like that? You smell like you've been smoking. And I said, no, I haven't been smoking. And she looked at me in the eyes, and she said, you haven't been smoking? And I said, no. And she left it alone. And coming from a foster home that it didn't matter what I said. I was accused of everything. If it looked like I did it, coming from that and then going to someone who believed what I said, I remembered that. She gave me the benefit of the doubt. She never brought it up again. And I remembered that. I remembered that kindness and that belief in me that I really am not a bad kid. The kindness that I saw in Granny. And she took this kid who was very standoffish and to herself, and I was able to come out of my shell in her home because she treated me like one of her own. When I had to go to a court date to fight my mom, this was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. My mom finally got better, and she wanted me to move back to Chicago, and I didn't want to move back to Chicago. I was doing really good at school, and I had to go against what my mom wanted me to do and stay here, and Granny was right by my side. And that was one of the hardest things I've had to do, was tell my mom no. And some people don't do that until they're 18, 21. I was 16 years old. That was extremely hard for me to do, and Granny was right there. Granny also introduced me to a world of high society. I wouldn't have known what a debutante was or tubing was or anything like that. And she cooked these healthy meals, and we were a family. And that kindness that she extended to me, I'm now able to exemplify and give that to people that I see in need. So the good part about my story is that I saw a lot of humility in a lot of people. I saw that. And I still to this day believe humility is a little hard. It's easy to get caught up in your own story and your own life, but when I think back to when I was in need, then I can tap into it a little bit more. And so I was going through this, and I'm going, now, Sanni, did you answer the question? So how do you remember the often forgotten, homeless, prisons, people in poverty? How do you remember that? I mean, you've gone through this whole story in your head. That's great. But how do you remember them? And I believe the answer to that question is remember your humility. Remember that you are no different than anybody else. We're all equal. Something somebody told me in my early 20s was life happens to everybody. It just happens to them at different times. And so I have one last story for you to wrap this up, and then I have a quote, and then I'm going to be quiet. But now I work at KMOJ. I work at a community radio station. Their focus is the urban community, communities of color. More focused on the urban community, but the way I got into radio was I won a scholarship, I won this contest, and I just thought I was big stuff. I won a contest. They can see my untapped potential. And this was at Brown College, and so they allowed me to get a scholarship where I could move to St. Louis and go to radio broadcasting school, and I came back, and I hit the ground running. I volunteered at KFAI, I volunteered at NPR, I interned at KDWB. Like, I hit the ground running. I was ready. I just know it's my time is coming. When people get in the radio, they immediately think fame. They don't think the getting the coffee. They don't think, no one sees that. Everyone sees the flash. They have no idea what you have to do before you even get to the mic. So as I'm working my way up, I finally make my way to KMOJ where I'm at now. And I literally skyrocketed. My topics, my first show was 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., so I finally got my own show. I've been interning, and I finally got my own show. I don't care that it's 2 in the morning. And I'm like, I know it's a matter of time. I'm going to get my day spot. It's just a matter of time. And sure enough, they pull me up. Like, my topics overnight, people are engaged, people are calling in. I've got these really, really crazy topics that people love. My boss is listening. She calls me and said, would you like to be on drive time? Now, I don't know if anybody knows in radio, but drive time is really, really important. Morning drive and afternoon drive is really important. That's the biggest audience for radio, at least. Yeah, they still pull in pretty good numbers. And so I'm like, yeah, my time is coming. I'm here. So I go to the afternoon drive time, and I do not get along with the person who's been there for 30 years at the station. I'm bumping heads with the worst person to bump heads with. And so in my mind at the time, I had been bullied and beat up and told what to do for so long. So now I feel like I'm not going to let anybody push me around. I don't care who it is. I don't care that this person's been here for 30 years. I'm not going to let anybody push me around. And I bumped heads, and I lost. And they sent me back to overnight. So I'm mad. I'm bitter. I'm ticked off about this. And I stayed overnights for about 2 years until the end of last year. And I just stopped going. I stopped going. And my mom and my sister, my daughter was like, you're going to quit right? Like, what's wrong with you? You're going to quit? And I'm like, I need to take a break. I need to really reevaluate why I'm doing this. You have to love what you're doing in order to get up at 1 in the morning when it's 35 below. You have to. And if you don't, you give yourself some time to figure out why. And I was just at a point where I was so ticked off because I found out that the numbers were increasing. I just knew I had it going on. And I was so the opposite of humble at this time. And I stopped. And so I took a break, and I'm really trying to figure out, is this really what you want to do? If not, that's fine. You can walk away from it. I'm not going to be upset with you, Sanni, if this isn't what you want. But if this is what you want, find a good reason for why you want to do this. And I struggled for weeks. I'm like, I have no idea why I want to do this. What could possibly get me up in the cold? Has anybody ever got up and driven somewhere in the cold when it's 30? It looks like a wasteland. It's really scary. It's lonely. And so I see this movie on Netflix. It's called Call Me Crazy. And the movie features 5 stories with people who have been dealing with some form of mental illness. There's someone in there that's dealt with PTSD, someone's dealt with schizophrenic disorder, someone's dealt with bipolar disorder. And I didn't even get past the first story. I started crying because I knew exactly what they were going through. To be a family member dealing with somebody who's dealing with that and not knowing how to deal with that hit home for me. So I was in tears after the first story. And the first story features a young girl. She is a law student, and she has schizophrenia. She knows she has schizophrenia, but she doesn't want to take her medicine. She feels like she can beat this. She's stronger than this. She can get past this, and she has an episode that scares everybody. So her family sends her to a center to get therapy, and she's struggling to get used to being with these crazy people. You know, she doesn't feel like she's like them. And so the last conversation that happens before they go to the next story, she's talking to her therapist, and her therapist is asking her, how are you holding up? And she's like, she feels like this isn't supposed to be happening to her. I'm a law student. My life's supposed to be totally different. And the therapist says, maybe this is an opportunity for you to continue doing what you're doing, but just to work with special cases, basically. It wasn't in that wording, but she was challenging her to embrace her schizophrenia. So then the second story goes by, the third story goes by, the fourth story goes by, the fifth story goes by. And this story is with Jennifer Hudson, and she's dealing with PTSD. And the stress and the trauma that happened to her was she was raped by someone who was over her, who happened to be best friends with her father. And she didn't know how to tell her father. And so this guy dies, and her father's like, not only is it your military right, it's your American duty to go and pay your respects, and she did not want to go. And when she does, she has a traumatic episode. She wets herself, and they don't say anything. Further on in the story, she does something so violent that it costs her child. She no longer can be with her child. And so she's at her house kind of depressed. She's not only lost her rank as, her military rank, she's also lost her child, and she's looking really worn, and she's given up hope. And in comes this lawyer, and it's the lawyer, the girl from the first story. And the woman's, Jennifer Hudson's like, what are you going to do for me? There's nothing you could do for me. And she's like, I actually have some insights on what you're going through. And so I had to check myself. I had to give myself a reality check. I don't have schizophrenia. And if this person can embrace what they're going through and use what they have to help other people, I can do that. And so after literally crying for 2 days, it hit me. All the times that I was lonely and feeling unwanted, I could help people overnight who are feeling lonely and unwanted. I don't know if anybody in here has ever worked overnight. It's a really, really lonely and cold shift. It really is. The loneliness that I dealt with was during the day. There's times where I get up and I'm like, I know nobody's awake. But my experience with feeling unwanted and feeling lonely, I know my importance of going in and just volunteering 3 hours of my time to people who are lonely, who are losing faith in their circumstances, who are losing hope. And right before I went to go back in, somebody emails me. I got fan mail. Yeah. And he says, I noticed you haven't been on the air. I really hope you come back, because I really like that saying you say at the end of your show. At the end of every show, I say, be empowering, be inspiring, and most importantly, be you. And when I say be you, I mean be the best damn you can be. And for somebody to not to email me and tell me, I really hope you come back, or I hope you've been on vacation. Like, I would have lost hope in the radio personality if they didn't come in. But the fact that they still were like, I just want to reach out to you and ask, I hope you're not quitting, because I really like what you're doing. That gave me inspiration, because obviously that person needs to hear the things that I'm saying. So the last quote I'm going to leave you with is this. It's by Gordon B. Hinckley. And this is what I mean when I say humility ability. And this is what I've learned from the people who have helped me my whole life. Being humble means you recognize that you're not on this earth to figure out how important you can become. Being humble means that you recognize that it's your job to figure out how you can change other people's lives. And so with that, thank you. I am told that this is the question asking portion. So, and my intention at the beginning was, because I'm more of a laid back speaker, and the way I learn, I hate waiting all the way to the end to ask questions. So please forgive me, because my intent was to tell you that you could ask questions along the way, but since we're all the way over here. Yeah.
So are you still working at the radio station?
I'm still working. Right? I'm still working at the radio station. No, I'm a behavioral therapist. I work at the Minnesota Autism Center. I work with children who have ASD, and I believe they work with, I'm not sure if they work with Asperger's, I'm not sure, but all the children that I've worked with have been, I'm sure they are, but all the children that I've worked with have been diagnosed with autism disorder, and it is my favorite time of the day. I get to play with kids for a living, so. Oh, while I was in foster care? I didn't at first. And I remember, it was two reasons why. I remember when I first moved into that first foster home, she pulls me into a room and she says, do you see these grades? This isn't going to happen here. And so I am defiant by nature, I am. There's a little fireball inside. There's a big fireball inside of me. So the first reason was to prove her wrong, that I could do it. And two was because I've always been an achiever. I like to achieve things. So that was my own little, it was my way of not only achieving something for me, but it was my way to get my mind off everything that was going on. So it gave me something to be happy about. I remember when my grades were really bad at the beginning of my sophomore year, and then the third quarter, my teacher says, congratulations. I'm walking in the hallway like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you're on the honor roll. So that just gave me little pieces of joy in the midst of all the mess I was dealing with at home. Did that answer the question? Okay. Yes?
First of all, I think you have an amazing amount of resilience.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I would kind of like your feelings about, I've read a lot of history and recently about foster care. And from your view, how can it be made better? Because I think there's times when I was listening to you or that I was hoping that you could get better response.
My experience with foster care is such an interesting one, because I don't want to say a bad home. I had a not so good experience, and then I had a great experience. So what made this second home great was being treated like I was a part of the family. I think that goes back to Mother Teresa's feeling, unwanted and loneliness, and I felt lonely at home. That's just the God's honest truth. I felt lonely. So just the fact that she just embraced me, like it was so opposite. Like this first home, they got upset with me for doing typical teenager things, like you came home 15 minutes late, and this home, she was like, why didn't you go tubing with us? Like, the reason why she got mad was not something that I hear typical parents of teenagers get upset about. She wanted to hang out with me. So if you were to ask me what will make a home better, it's helping the child take their mind off the mess they're having to deal with. Helping them get past that, because I think that's with anybody. I think that's adults. If you can just for a second take your mind and put your energy on to something else and not get swallowed up in all the bad that's happening, I think that's a good coping mechanism. And that's what she did. Like, that's crazy to me. I'm going to say this. I'm not sure if this is true, but I don't know how many African Americans go tubing. Like, that was new to me at the time. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are, but culturally speaking, I don't think that's something that I see African Americans do. And me and my boyfriend, we were like, wow, that was kind of cool. That was cool. So, and just to introduce me to these new things and stimulate me in different ways. And she just helped me take my mind off the madness. And I even remember when I broke up with him, she was there. She hugged me like a parent. She rocked me in her bed like I was her own child. And I know that I wouldn't have necessarily received that support from the first home. So don't treat them like a money case. Treat them like humans.
What was the opposition with them?
In my second foster home, oh, it was huge. It was Granny. There was no father figure, so to speak. It was Granny. She kind of reminds me of like Mae West or something like that. But there was Granny, me, Tootie, Mimi, Harvetta. It was a lot of girls in there. They were kind of coming and going. But I think for the most part, we usually had 4 or 5 girls in the house. It was a pretty big house. No. We had 8-year-olds in there at one time. I mean, because it constantly changed, because we had some kids run away, which was beyond me. Granny made roast. Like, and that was the first time, her home was the first time I learned what hot dish was. For the longest, I thought it was casserole, but in Minnesota, it's hot dish. So, but it just, the girls were changing. They were girls that ran away and came back, but the ages spanned from 7 or 8 to sometimes 19, 20. It spanned, and we had fights like sisters. We came together like sisters. If somebody was messing with you, like it was a family. It was a family. It was a very weird family, but it was a family. It was something I needed at that time, because I had lost what I considered a family, and to go into this family, which is still new to me, but it's still a support system. It was right on time for me. Yes.
Did you have any contact with your father?
We came really close. We came really close to contacting my father. We used Facebook. We have family members on his side who use Facebook. They have like a family page, and we came really close. But the message that I'm getting from my father is I don't think he wants to be contacted, and I think, like I told you, it might be a pride thing. I think my dad thinks that we're upset with him. For years, I live with my mom right now. I take care of her. She's spoiled beyond reason. I live with my mom, my sister, my daughter, my nephew. And for years, my mom moved in with me when I first had my daughter. And it took about 5 years, 6 maybe, for my mom to believe me that I wasn't upset with her. And a lot of my family members thought, my sister and I, because we were in foster home, they thought we were angry with them. And we weren't at all. I never had any anger towards them, and I'm guessing that might be the same thing with my dad. We came close. His sister said, "We know where he's at. We're gonna contact him within the month," and it's been 3 years since that conversation. And I'm praying that I can meet up with him because I was his first child, and I was a girl, and he was like, "That's not a girl," but my sister had a boy, so I think it'd be really awesome for him to meet his grandson, and he's got the same name as him, but as of yet, no. Yes, it took 10 years before she got any help. Yeah, I'll say 8 years. She has schizoaffective disorder. And it was when I was in my first foster home that the first time I got to talk to her, before I found out what it was. And we didn't really talk about it. We didn't really talk about what was wrong with her. Now we do. Even now when I tell her that I'm speaking about it, I'm really scared I'm still kind of scared to talk about it, because I don't know what I'm going to trigger. for her. But she's very open about it, and she tells me the episodes that she had. And have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind? I saw that movie, and I said, wow, I see why Russell Crowe won all those awards. And I said, is schizophrenia really like that? She said, yeah. It's really like that. Like I think his case was an extreme case where he really thought it was like scenarios, but for her, she said it's voices. And schizoaffective disorder is not there's some similarities with schizophrenia, but you will hear it's not schizophrenia. It's a cross between depression and bipolar disorder or something like that. So, but I ask her, sometimes I try to peek into her mind, and now when I have conversations, for a while I would get upset with my mom because I would have conversations with her and she'd say things and it wouldn't make sense to me and I'd get really mad. And I had to check myself. I'm like, come on, you're a mental health practitioner. You have to know better that your mom is going to have still some residue of the things she's dealing with. And I say about 2 months ago she had an episode and it was about money and she started crying. She was crying because it's not that we didn't have heat or we were getting put out or anything. She just wanted pocket money. And she had an episode, and I fuss at her about this, but she'll go some days without taking her medicine. And that really frustrates me because my mom is high functioning, so try to find the balance of you're high functioning, you know how to get your medicine, but you still have schizoaffective disorder. So, I mean, it's hard for me to find that balance of does she know what she's doing, or is her schizoaffective disorder affecting what she's doing? It can get a little frustrating to me.
It took a long time. 8 years is a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But was she going back and forth from Chicago to Minnesota?
Oh, she went all over the country. She I heard she was sleeping on benches. She said she went back to see my family in Mississippi, which is where all my family is originally from before we moved to Chicago, my last generation of people. She said she visited her aunts and stuff like that and went home, but she said she went all across the country. And at that time when I was hearing things about my mom, I didn't want to hear anything about my mom. I couldn't hear, because my mom's such an ambitious, from the mom that I knew in Chicago when I was young, you have to be ambitious to live in Chicago. Like, it's cutthroat there. I've heard people who have lived here and then moved there say how cutthroat it is, how it's a lot more relaxed here. It's a lot more nice and friendly and slow-paced and kind of chill in comparison with Chicago. So my mom she worked downtown, and she was just this ambitious, get-it-done kind of woman. If we weren't going to have Christmas, she made it happen. And then to go to she's sleeping on park benches, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. That was too much for me. Yes?
Of all the elements that are not functioning in the system, what is the greatest improvement?
Of the foster care system? The whole thing. Of everything that's happened to me? Hate to sound cliche, but humility. Taking time out. I'm struggling with humility myself. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm struggling with it. I'm not going to sit here and tell everybody else to be humble. It's a struggle. But I think remembering that we're equals, and that if I was in that situation, I would want A, B, C, and D. I think that is the hardest struggle, but that's the best way to help people, is to remember that we're actually, my mom told me this, and I've never heard this anywhere else, but she said, humans are here for comfort. We're here to comfort each other. And I understand you have to pay bills and you get caught up in ambition and you want this career and you want this car and you want this for your kids and you want to eat healthy and there's all these other distractions. But if we remember that our greatest cause really is to help each other, I think that's a good place to start. I don't have all the answers, but for me, I think that's a good place to start. It helps me when I go in at 2 a.m. We're here for comfort. We're here to, in whatever way that you can help. Not everybody's going to help in the same way, but whatever it is you can do, a smile, a hug, a song, a bag of chips, whatever it is you can do, I think that's our human duty to each other, is to extend that hand. And it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. It's hard, but I think that's a good place to start.
So at 2 in the morning, on the radio, is it a talk show that you do, or is it music, or interspersed, or
It's a mixture of both. The complaint that here's the thing. I don't get ratings information about my show. I mean, I do, but I would have to pay for it. The radio station doesn't think it's important to get ratings for 2 in the morning because nobody else is dumb enough to go in and 2 in the morning. So they don't invest in that time slot for who's listening in, and so everything I'm doing is trial and error. But so far, if I talk about, I started this show out with, I'm going to talk about stuff that nobody else talks about, and it works. People respond. And then it's kind of evolved into, I'm going to talk about stuff that nobody else talks about, but it's going to be more positive. When I started, it was like really negative and risque, and it got listeners, but I didn't like the mindset it was putting me in. So now I like to be a little bit more bright and positive and informative and entertaining. So it's a healthy mix of talk and music. The one complaint that people have about KMOJ is they talk too much. They complain that they talk too much, so it's me trial and error trying to find that balance. I've had mornings where I didn't talk a lot, and people were like, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" And then I've had mornings where I've exhausted a topic, and they're like, maybe we should move on. So it's trial and error. I'm trying to serve my audience, but I'm really shooting in the dark, literally.
I think they might, have they replayed some of your talks, though, or something like NPR or something?
No.
Because I never always get to it. I know I heard you from somewhere.
Someone always says that. I've heard, somebody's like, have you done that? I do other voice work. I've done voice work for co-ops, and I've worked with TPT a couple times. So I've hosted several SPNN shows. So you might definitely recognize the voice, but not at NPR though. I was the news lady at NPR. So. Cool beans? All right.
And to wrap it up, I'll have you pick our door prize winner.
Oh, cool. Sandra Host? Oh, with all the questions. Awesome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Thank you.